D.B. Cooper has to be one of, if not the most mysterious criminals in American history. And one of the most intriguing. I think a lot of people can agree that what this guy pulled off and how he did it is actually pretty impressive. That is, if he managed to live. But today I'm going over a ton of evidence and conspiracy theories as to what happened to this guy and who he really is. We're going to start off the list with a very involved and recent investigation that may have shed light on Cooper's real identity. This investigation was led by Eric Ulis, who had discovered very small particles of metal on Cooper's famous black clip-on tie that had been left on the plane. These tiny particles would be key and possibly solving the mystery as to who D.B. Cooper really was. These metal particles were analyzed, and Ulis was able to connect these particles to one specific Pennsylvania metal manufacturing company, which was operational at the time and had patents on those metals and alloys. Ulis then contacted the company and dug through records of employees from the 60s and 70s. He narrowed it down to 8 researchers who were working on similar metal projects back in the day. A retired manager told Ulis that a guy named Vince Petersen, who used to work for the company, matched D.B. Cooper's description. Petersen even had a history of traveling to the Pacific Northwest for business during that time. Now, unfortunately, Petersen passed away in 2002, but Ulis was able to track down Petersen's son. Unfortunately, though, he didn't buy into the whole idea that his dad could have been Dan Cooper. Next up, we have another possible identity of D.B. Cooper, that being the uncle of a woman named Marla Cooper. Marla Cooper wrote a whole book on her supposed connection to the infamous D.B. Cooper. According to her, her uncle was the man responsible. Family would make comments here and there that would allude to it, but it was when her dad started talking about his long-lost brother, saying he was likely alive but hiding from the FBI, that Marla really took notice. She asked her father why he'd be hiding, and according to Marla, her father told her, quote, "Don't you remember? He hijacked that plane." At the time of the incident, Marla was only 8 years old, but she vividly remembers the day after the whole plane thing went down. Her uncle, LD, returned home after going turkey hunting. He was all bruised up and injured and claimed he'd been in a car accident. What's also interesting about this Uncle LD guy is that he was an outdoorsman and was also familiar with the general area D.B. Cooper may have landed, having grown up in Sisters, Oregon. Next up, we have a possible explanation for what may have happened to D.B. Cooper, that he didn't vanish, he just died by drowning. This one is pretty easy to explain. He jumped out of the plane, didn't time things right, and instead of parachuting down to dry land, he ended up in the middle of the water. And if his parachute was damaged, it could have sank to the bottom of the water with him, if he was even able to get it open in the first place. There are lots of possible places he may have drowned, but the most likely is the Columbia River. Many members of the FBI believe Cooper didn't survive his jump. He didn't have the right equipment for the jump. The weather was incredibly harsh. A large portion of his ransom money was also discovered, and he didn't have a plan as for where he was actually going to land. He agreed to alter the flight path mid-flight, meaning there was no way he could have been organizing with an accomplice on the ground to meet him at a designated landing site. Another possibility is that his parachute just failed, or he was unable to open it after the extreme cold weather in the air caused him to pass out. So he very well could have just fallen to his death, landing somewhere deep in the forest. According to Larry Carr, who led an investigation between 2006 and 2009, he thinks Cooper was likely an Air Force aircraft cargo loader. This would mean he'd have aviation knowledge, some basic jump training, and would be familiar with parachutes, as Cooper seemed to be on the night of the hijacking. However, he may not have had, quote, sufficient knowledge to survive the jump he made, especially at night, in the rain with extreme winds, and not wearing the proper equipment needed for a jump. For example, he had no jump boots. A man named Earl Cossey, a former skydiving instructor who packed the parachutes that Cooper ended up using, stated that jumping at night is already risky, and without jump boots, he could have suffered severe ankle or leg injuries once he hit the ground. So let's hone in on the weather for a minute. Not only was it insane to jump out of a speeding plane thousands of feet in the air, but he also picked the worst day to do it. There was a harsh storm at the time. If he didn't have parachute problems and was actually able to land, there's a good chance he may have died of exposure. Cooper had a paper bag with him apparently, but nobody knows the contents of that bag, but some speculate it could have been basic stuff like goggles for the jump, maybe gloves, but it wasn't a big bag. Wouldn't have been a big puffy winter jacket in there or anything. So if Cooper didn't pass out from hypothermia in the air and, fall to his death, he may have died of exposure once he made it to land, being that he was in a remote area with nothing but the clothes on his back and some cash. Again, some of which was discovered left behind. But let's move away from the whole death part for a bit, because a lot of folks think he did make it, including some in the FBI. FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach was pretty convinced that Cooper didn't survive the jump at first, but he ended up changing his mind when a bunch of copycat cases took place, and the planejackers all survived their jumps. And some of these guys seemed to have a lot less experience with parachutes than Dan Cooper did. One man, Martin McNally, needed to be shown how to put on his parachute, but he jumped out of the plane at night over Indiana and he made it. Not away from the law, he went straight to prison, but he did live. In a 1976 Seattle Times article, another FBI agent who spoke anonymously stated he thought Cooper made it and slept in his own bed that night. But the anonymous part is going to bring me to my next point. There's also been this conspiracy floating around for years that Dan Cooper was part of some covert operation, that this entire thing had been planned from the start. This would mean he didn't really vanish, and that members of the FBI actually know his whereabouts, they just aren't allowed to say anything. Now, as for what this covert operation would have been, that's where things get pretty ridiculous, because really this is pure speculation. One idea is that Cooper had insider info about the government and the whole hijacking was a cover-up for a secret mission. Some folks claim that he had help from powerful people who wanted to use the hijacking as a distraction for something else going on behind the scenes. Then there's the money. Cooper got a hefty ransom, and some of it turned up, but most of it was never found. Some think the missing cash is evidence that he had help from higher-ups who wanted to fund some, off-the-books kinds of operations. Personally, I don't really buy the whole inside job thing. It just seems far too convoluted, but what do you all think? Now, of course, if Cooper did survive and was on the run from the law, he would have taken on a different identity. Or not. Dan Cooper was very likely not his real name, so he may have just gone back to his regular life like nothing happened. Interestingly, there were no missing persons reports that matched his description. If he had died, you'd think some friends or family would have contacted the police, right? Now, the portion of ransom money that was found by a boy vacationing with family led some to believe Cooper may have drowned in the Columbia River. I mean, who would want to leave $5,800 behind? Well, Dan Cooper seemed like a pretty smart guy, and there's a chance he may have intentionally left some of the cash behind to throw investigators off. So the next question is, where did he go once he landed? Did he just return to his job like nothing happened? Did he assume an entirely new identity and leave the country? Was he even from the United States? Well, there's a chance that he wasn't. There's a very interesting thing that hints at the possibility of Dan Cooper having been from Canada, more specifically French-Canadian, and it all ties into the name he chose to call himself, Dan Cooper. There's a Belgian-written comic book featuring a character named Dan Cooper, a heroic Canadian pilot who would often parachute out of planes in his many adventures. These comics were pretty well known in Quebec, so Dan Cooper may have been a pretty big fan of Dan Cooper. Now, nobody reported the guy having an accent, which puts a bit of a hole in this theory. However, most Quebecers know and speak English very well, and there are plenty who only have a very faint hint of an accent. So it is possible that Cooper went back to Canada after this whole incident, laundered his money, and lived in complete secret. Finally, though, we have the lack of remains. We have a general area of where Cooper would have landed, so if he didn't survive, why has there never been a body found? No parachute. Now, this is a big deal, because if he'd crashed or something, you'd expect to find at least one of those things. The area where he supposedly jumped was a tough one. Thick forests and tricky terrain, but even with all the extensive searches, no parachute ever turned up. There have been bits of parachute pieces found over the years, but none of these turned out to be what Cooper used. So some say the absence of this stuff hints that Cooper didn't vanish. He may just have pulled off the coolest, cleanest getaway in American history. With all that said, I've been your host, James, and I will catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.